The candle nearest the altar went out first, and nobody noticed except Adrian Whitmore. He stood at the back of the chapel, pressed against cold stone, watching a woman he loved marry a man he despised. Her name was Elena Hartley. In a few minutes she would not be Hartley anymore. She would belong to Edward Voss, a merchant with soft hands and a hard reputation, a man twice her age who had bought her family out of debt and called it love. Adrian's chest felt tight, like something inside him was being folded smaller and smaller until it could fit inside a coat pocket and never be spoken of again. He was a duke. Dukes did not marry the daughters of ruined winemakers. He had told himself this every night for 2 years, and every night it had worked a little less. Elena walked down the aisle in a dress that did not fit her right, borrowed from an aunt who had died the winter before. Her hands trembled around a bouquet of white flowers that someone else had chosen for her. She did not look at the groom. She did not look at anyone. Her eyes stayed fixed on a point somewhere above the altar, as if she were trying to memorize the ceiling so she would have somewhere else to be. Adrian had known her since she was 17. He remembered her laughing in a field, her boots covered in mud, her hair coming loose from its pins because she never could keep it tidy. He remembered the day her father's vineyard failed, and the quiet that fell over her after that, a quiet that had never fully lifted. He had never told her how he felt. Not once. Not in 3 years of visits disguised as business, not in the letters he wrote and burned before sending, not in the moment last spring when she had looked at him with something that might have been hope, right before her father announced her engagement to Edward Voss. Adrian could have stopped it. He had the money. He had the name. He had everything a man needed to save a woman from a marriage she did not want, and he had used none of it because he was afraid of what his mother would say, afraid of what his title would lose, afraid of 100 small deaths that mattered less than the one happening in front of him now. The priest asked if anyone objected. Adrian's mouth opened. No sound came out. The moment passed like a held breath finally released, and then it was over. Elena Hartley became Elena Voss, and Adrian Whitmore turned and walked out of the chapel before the final blessing was spoken. He did not look back. He could not. Some things a man does not stay to watch, because watching them makes him a coward twice. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, and it did nothing to loosen the knot in his chest. His carriage waited at the edge of the churchyard. He climbed in without a word to his driver, and as the wheels began to turn, he allowed himself one small, private ruin. He closed his eyes and pictured her 17 years old again, laughing, muddy, alive in a way she would probably never be allowed to be again. He did not cry. Dukes did not cry over women they were too afraid to claim. But something in him closed that day, like a door shutting on a room he intended never to enter again. The following months blurred together the way grief does when nobody is allowed to call it grief. Adrian returned to London. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had already selected a bride for him, a young woman named Margaret Ellison, sensible and well-connected and entirely unremarkable in every way that mattered to Adrian. He agreed to court her because agreeing was easier than explaining why he didn't want to. He attended dinners. He danced at balls. He learned to smile at the correct moments and laugh at jokes that were not funny. He became, by every outward measure, the duke he was supposed to be. At night, alone in his study, he sometimes allowed himself to wonder how Elena was faring as a merchant's wife. He told himself she was safe. He told himself she was provided for. He told himself this so often that he almost believed it. He did not know, could not have known, that 2 counties away, Edward Voss had already begun losing money at card tables faster than he made it, that he drank most evenings until his hands shook worse than Elena's ever had, that the tenderness he'd shown during their courtship had curdled into something colder within the first year of marriage. Adrian did not know any of this. He only knew that he had let her go, and that some nights the not knowing was worse than any answer could have been. Margaret Ellison was kind to him in her practical way. She spoke of household budgets and charity events and the proper seating arrangements for formal dinners. She never once asked him what he was thinking about when his eyes went distant during their walks in the garden, and for that, at least, Adrian was grateful. He did not think he could have answered honestly. The engagement was announced in the autumn. His mother wept with relief. His tenants sent gifts. Adrian stood in the middle of his own celebration and felt like a man watching his life happen to someone who merely resembled him. He told himself this was what growing up looked like: choosing duty, setting aside foolish feelings for a girl in a muddy field who probably didn't think of him at all anymore. He was wrong about that last part, though he would not learn it for years. Alina thought of him often, in the small moments between her husband's demands, in the quiet after his temper had passed and left the house ringing with silence. She thought of a young man who had once watched her laugh like it was the only interesting thing in the world. She never allowed herself to finish the thought. There was no use in it. She had made her choice, or rather, her choice had been made for her, and dwelling on the road not taken only made the road she was on feel longer. She wrote to her younger sister Clara every month, letters full of small, careful lies about how well things were going. She did not mention the nights Edward came home smelling of drink and cards. She did not mention the way her jewelry box grew emptier each season, piece by piece, sold to cover debts she was never allowed to see the full account of. She did not mention that she had started flinching at the sound of the front door. She told herself this was simply what marriage looked like, that every wife endured some version of this. That complaining would only make Clara worry, and Clara had enough to worry about already, caring for their ailing mother in the cottage they'd been allowed to keep after the vineyard failed. 2 years passed this way. Adrian married Margaret in a ceremony that felt, to him, like the mirror image of the one he'd stood at the back of years before, except this time he was the one at the altar, and this time no candle went out, and this time nobody's hands shook but his own briefly, before he steadied them and said his vows in a clear, dutiful voice. He became, in the eyes of the world, a settled man, a married duke, a pillar of exactly the life he was born to live. But there were nights, rare and unwelcome, when he dreamed of a field and mud and laughter, and woke with his chest tight in that old familiar way, and lay in the dark beside his sleeping wife wondering if he had made the greatest mistake of his life by saying nothing, all those years ago, when saying something might have changed everything. He never spoke of these dreams to anyone. He filed them away, like old letters he could not bring himself to burn but would also never send. Alina's 3rd year of marriage brought a new and quiet fear. Edward's debts had grown beyond anything she understood, and his health had begun to fail alongside his fortune, as though his body were simply following the example his choices had set. She nursed him through fevers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, doctors' bills piling on top of gambling debts, until the house felt less like a home and more like a ledger she could never balance. She stopped writing to Clara about anything except the weather. There was nothing else safe to say. One evening in early winter, Edward did not come home at all. A messenger arrived instead, his hat in his hands, his eyes unable to meet hers as he explained that her husband had collapsed at a card table and would not be waking again. Alina did not cry immediately. She sat very still in the parlor, listening to the clock on the mantel, waiting to feel something she could name. Grief came eventually, but it arrived tangled with something else, something she was ashamed of and could not fully deny: relief. The quiet after his temper, the absence of flinching, the strange, guilty lightness of a woman whose cage door had finally, terribly, opened. She wore black for the appropriate length of time. She accepted condolences from neighbors who did not know the truth of her marriage and would not have believed it if she told them. And beneath the mourning veil, she began to understand, slowly and with growing dread, exactly what her husband had left behind. It was not just grief waiting for her in that house. It was ruin. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and older regret, Elena sat across from a thin man named Mr. Garrick, who read out the details of her husband's estate in a voice as flat as the numbers he was reciting. There was no estate, not really. There were debts. Debts to the wine merchant, debts to the tailor, debts to 3 separate men who had won them at cards over the course of a single bad year, and a mortgage on the house itself that had been taken out without her knowledge, 6 months before Edward died. Elena listened without speaking. She had learned over 3 years of marriage that speaking rarely changed anything, and it seemed unlikely to start now. When Mr. Garrick finished, he folded his hands and looked at her with something close to pity. He asked if she had family who could help her. She thought of Clara, caring for their mother in a cottage that was barely large enough for 2 people, let alone 3. She thought of her father, 3 years in the ground, unable to help anyone anymore. She said no, she did not have family who could help her, and Mr. Garrick nodded as though he had expected that answer. The house sold within 2 months, enough to cover the mortgage and a portion of the debts. Elena moved what remained of her belongings into 2 trunks and took a room above a bakery in a smaller town, 3 days' journey from the estate she had once called home. She told herself this was temporary. She told herself many things during that first winter alone, most of which she did not believe even as she thought them. The furniture went next. A dining table that had belonged to Edward's mother, sold to a merchant for less than half its worth. A set of chairs. A writing desk she had once imagined using to compose letters to a happier version of her life. Piece by piece, the physical evidence of her marriage disappeared into other people's houses, and Elena found she did not miss most of it. It was easier to let go of things that had never truly felt like hers. The silver was harder. It had been a wedding gift from a distant relative, engraved with initials that were no longer entirely accurate, since half of them belonged to a man who was dead, and the other half to a name she was already beginning to think of as something she used to be called. She sold it to a pawnbroker in a narrow shop that smelled of metal polish and dust, and she did not haggle over the price, because haggling required an energy she no longer had in reserve. Clara wrote to her constantly during this time, worried letters full of questions Elena did not answer honestly. She told her sister that she was managing well enough, that widowhood suited her better than marriage had, small jokes meant to disguise the truth that some mornings she woke up uncertain whether she had enough money left for bread, let alone rent. She took in sewing work to make ends meet, mending torn hems and replacing buttons for women who barely looked at her twice, women who did not know that the tired seamstress hunched over their garments had once dined at tables set with silver bearing her own initials. There was a strange kind of peace in this anonymity, even as there was a constant, gnawing worry about money that never fully left her. She thought of Adrian sometimes in these quiet, exhausted evenings, though she tried not to let herself linger on those thoughts for long. She had heard, through a cousin's letter 2 years earlier, that he had married a woman named Margaret, sensible and well-liked, from a family with proper connections. Elena had felt something complicated upon reading that news, a mixture of happiness for him and a small, private ache she refused to name, and then she had folded the letter away and returned to whatever practical task needed her attention. It did no good to think of what might have been. She had learned that lesson well during her marriage, learned it in the quiet hours after Edward's temper had passed, learned it in the way regret could eat a person alive if allowed enough room to grow. Winter turned to spring, and spring brought a letter from Clara that changed the shape of Elena's worry entirely. Their mother's health had worsened. The doctor Clara had consulted spoke of a treatment available in the city, expensive but promising, the kind of treatment that required money neither sister possessed in any meaningful amount. Elena read the letter 3 times before setting it down. She looked around the small room above the bakery, at the 2 trunks that held everything she owned, and understood with sudden clarity that she had almost nothing left to sell. Almost nothing. There was one item left, tucked into the lining of a plain gray coat, hidden there so carefully that even Edward, in his most desperate moments, had never found it. A sapphire brooch, small and old, shaped like a cluster of forget-me-nots, passed down from Alina's grandmother, who had worn it at her own wedding decades before the vineyard had ever failed, before any of the ruin that followed had even begun. Alina had kept it hidden through 3 years of marriage, through every debt Edward accumulated, through every desperate late-night search he conducted through her belongings when the card tables had emptied his pockets. She had told herself it was for emergencies, though she had never fully allowed herself to imagine what kind of emergency would be severe enough to part with the last piece of her grandmother that remained in the world. Now she knew. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed that evening, the brooch cradled in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the small cool stones catching what little light came through the window. She thought of her grandmother's hands, weathered and strong, the way they had felt pressing this same brooch into Alina's palm years before, whispering something about keeping it safe, keeping it for a day when safety mattered more than sentiment. That day had arrived. She wrote back to Clara promising she would find the money, though she did not explain how. She did not want her sister worrying about the details, only wanted her to know that their mother would receive the treatment she needed, that Alina would find a way, because finding a way was the only skill her difficult years had truly taught her. The journey to the city took 2 days by coach, uncomfortable and cramped, shared with strangers who spoke of business and gossip, and none of the quiet dread pressing on Alina's chest the entire way. She had asked at the bakery for the name of a reputable jeweler in the city, someone who would give a fair price rather than take advantage of a woman traveling alone with something valuable to sell. The baker's wife had given her a name and an address, along with a look of quiet sympathy that told Alina the woman understood, without being told, exactly what kind of journey this was. The city was louder and larger than anywhere Alina had lived before. She kept close to the buildings as she walked, the brooch wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked deep inside her coat pocket, her hand resting over it as though someone might snatch it from her at any moment. Perhaps someone might have. She had heard stories of thieves in cities like this, preying on travelers who looked unfamiliar with the streets, and she certainly looked unfamiliar, glancing at street signs and doorways with the caution of someone who had never navigated a place this large. She found the jeweler's shop exactly where the baker's wife had described, a narrow storefront wedged between a tailor and a bookshop, its window displaying a modest selection of rings and necklaces that told Alina this was not the grandest jeweler in the city, which suited her purposes well enough. Grand shops asked grand questions. She wanted this transaction quick, quiet, and finished. She stood outside the door for a long moment before entering, gathering the kind of courage that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with necessity. Inside, the shop was small and dim, lit by a single lamp on the counter, behind which stood an older man with spectacles perched low on his nose, examining a piece of jewelry through a small glass. He looked up when the bell above the door rang, offering Alina a polite, professional smile that did not quite reach his eyes. She approached the counter and, before her nerve could fail her, drew the handkerchief from her pocket and unwrapped the brooch, setting it gently on the dark velvet pad the jeweler kept for such purposes. He picked it up with careful fingers, turning it toward the lamp, examining the stones and the setting with the kind of practiced eye that made Alina feel exposed, as though he could see not just the jewelry but the entire desperate story behind it. "Sapphires," he said finally, setting the brooch back down. "Old work, not much market for pieces this style anymore. I could offer you." He named a figure, spoken with the flat confidence of a man who expected no argument, and Alina felt something cold settle in her stomach. It was not enough. It was barely a fraction of what the treatment would cost, barely enough to cover the coach fare home, let alone anything beyond that. She opened her mouth to negotiate, though she had little practice in the art and even less confidence that it would help. The words she had rehearsed on the long journey here about the brooch's history, its craftsmanship, its sentimental value that surely translated to worth, began to form on her tongue. Before she could speak them, the bell above the door rang again, and a gust of colder air swept into the shop, along with the sound of footsteps that stopped abruptly somewhere behind her. Alina did not turn around. There was something in the quality of that pause, in the way the footsteps had stopped rather than continued toward the counter, that made the hair on the back of her neck rise, though she could not have explained why. It was not fear exactly. It was something older than fear, something that lived in the spine rather than the mind, a recognition that arrived before conscious thought could catch up to it. The jeweler glanced past her, toward the doorway, his expression shifting into something more attentive, more deferential, the kind of look shopkeepers reserved for customers whose clothing suggested deeper pockets than most. "My lord," the jeweler said, and something in those two words made Alina's chest tighten in a way she had not felt in 3 long years. She did not turn around immediately. Some part of her, the part that had spent 3 years learning to brace for disappointment before allowing herself hope, held her still, facing the counter, facing the brooch that represented the last piece of a life she had loved and lost. But the voice that answered the jeweler was one she would have recognized anywhere, in any city, after any number of years apart. A voice that had once called her name across a muddy field and made her laugh before she even understood why. "Alina." She turned around then, because some sounds could not be ignored, no matter how carefully a person had trained themselves to expect nothing from the world. Adrian Whitmore stood in the doorway of the jeweler's shop, older than she remembered, more settled in his bearing, dressed in the fine dark coat of a man who had never once had to sell a piece of silver to afford his next meal. But his eyes, when they met hers, held exactly the same expression she remembered from 3 years before, from a field full of mud and laughter, from a chapel where a candle had gone out and nobody but him had noticed. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The jeweler, sensing something significant passing between two people who had not planned to meet, busied himself with polishing a ring he did not need to polish, offering them a strange, awkward privacy in the middle of a public shop. Alina's hand tightened around the edge of the counter, steadying herself against a feeling she could not name, though it sat somewhere between joy and grief, and something far more complicated than either. "Adrian," she said finally, and his name in her mouth after 3 years of silence felt like the first honest thing she had spoken in longer than she could remember. For a moment, the small shop seemed to hold its breath along with them. The jeweler had retreated to the far end of the counter, still pretending to busy himself with the ring he no longer needed to polish, and outside the window the city went on with its noise and its hurry, entirely unaware that something quiet and enormous was happening inside this narrow storefront. Adrian took a step closer, and then stopped himself, as though remembering all at once that they were not 17 and 20 anymore, that 3 years and a marriage and a death had passed between the last time they stood this close to each other and now. "I did not expect," he began, and then seemed to lose the rest of the sentence entirely, his eyes moving briefly to the brooch still resting on the velvet pad, then back to her face, cataloging the changes 3 years had made. She was thinner than he remembered. There were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of exhaustion rather than simple tiredness. But she was still Alina, still the same woman whose laugh he had spent 3 years trying not to remember. "Nor did I," Alina said, and found herself reaching instinctively to cover the brooch with her hand, an old habit of protecting whatever small things she still owned, though there was no longer any point in hiding it from him. He had already seen it. He had already understood, with the quick intelligence that had always been one of his most striking qualities, exactly what she was doing in this shop and why. "You are selling this," he said, not quite a question, his voice carefully neutral in a way that told her he was working hard to keep judgment out of it. "Yes." "May I ask why?" Alina's first instinct was to lie, to offer some small, dignified excuse that would preserve whatever pride she had left. But looking at him now, at the genuine concern in his expression, concern that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with the same care she remembered from years before, she found she could not summon the energy for pretense. "My mother is ill," she said simply. "The treatment is expensive. This is the last thing of value I own." She watched something shift behind his eyes, a flicker of understanding followed by something harder to name, something that looked almost like anger, though she quickly realized it was not directed at her. "The jeweler was offering you far less than this is worth," Adrian said, turning toward the counter, his voice taking on the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The jeweler, who had clearly been listening despite his pretense of disinterest, straightened immediately. "My lord, the piece is quite old in its styling, market demand for such." "I will pay 3 times whatever figure you offered this lady," Adrian said, cutting through the excuse before it could fully form. "And you will not haggle over it, or I will take my business, and every piece of business I have ever brought you elsewhere." The jeweler's protests died in his throat. He glanced at Alina, then back at Adrian, and something in the Duke's expression must have convinced him that further argument would not be worth whatever profit he hoped to salvage from the transaction. He named the new figure, considerably higher than his original offer, and counted out the payment with hands that trembled slightly, whether from nerves or excitement Alina could not tell. She stood frozen through this entire exchange, torn between gratitude and a deep, uncomfortable pride that made accepting help feel almost like a betrayal of everything she had taught herself to be during 3 years of managing alone. When the jeweler finished counting the coins into a small pouch, Adrian took it from the counter and held it out to her, rather than allowing the jeweler to hand it over directly, as though the small gesture of passing it between his hands and hers carried some significance beyond mere courtesy. "I cannot accept charity," Alina said quietly, though she made no move to take the pouch from him, her hands remaining at her sides in a posture that was equal parts stubbornness and shame. "It is not charity," Adrian said. "It is a fair price for a valuable piece, which is precisely what the transaction should have been before I arrived. You are not accepting anything from me that was not rightfully yours to begin with." Alina studied his face for a long moment, searching for the pity she expected to find there, the kind of expression people had worn when they learned of her widowhood, sympathy tinged with a faint relief that the misfortune had happened to someone else. But she found none of that in Adrian's expression. What she found instead was something steadier, something that looked almost like respect, as though he understood without needing to be told exactly how much this moment cost her. She took the pouch. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate for everything they were meant to carry. Adrian nodded once, and for a moment neither of them seemed to know what should happen next. The jeweler, sensing the transaction had concluded, retreated further behind his counter, giving them what privacy a small public shop could offer. "How is your mother faring?" Adrian asked, and the question, simple as it was, seemed to open a door that Alina had not expected to walk through today. They talked for nearly an hour, standing in that narrow shop while the jeweler pretended not to listen, and the afternoon light slanted lower through the window. Alina told him, in careful, measured pieces, about her mother's illness, about Clara's cottage, about the sewing work that had kept her fed through the winter. She did not tell him everything. She did not tell him about Edward's temper, or the debts, or the particular quality of relief she had felt the day the messenger arrived with news of her husband's collapse. Some things still felt too raw, too complicated, too much like a wound that had only just begun to close. Adrian, for his part, spoke carefully about his own life, mentioning his marriage to Margaret in a tone that was respectful but noticeably without warmth, the way a man might describe a business arrangement rather than a partnership of the heart. Alina noticed this and said nothing, though she filed the observation away with a strange, guilty attentiveness, she was not proud of. "I have a position that might interest you," Adrian said eventually, after the conversation had wound its way through several careful, safe topics and arrived somewhere more purposeful. "My late mother left behind a charitable foundation, one that supports widows and families facing hardship. It requires someone to oversee its daily operations, someone with intelligence and discretion, and I think someone who understands from personal experience exactly what kind of support such families need." Alina's first instinct was to refuse. Accepting money for a brooch was one thing, an uncomfortable but ultimately fair transaction. Accepting a position from him felt like something else entirely, something that blurred a line she was not certain should be blurred, given everything unspoken that still existed between them. "I could not," she began, but Adrian raised a hand gently, not to silence her but to ask for a moment to finish his thought. "It would be honest work," he said. "Real work with a real salary, overseeing something that genuinely helps people. I am not offering you charity, Alina. I am offering you employment that I believe you would excel at, employment that has nothing to do with anything beyond your own capability." She wanted to believe him. She wanted, more than she was comfortable admitting even to herself, to trust that this offer came from nothing more complicated than professional respect and old friendship. But there was a part of her, the same part that had spent 3 years learning to distrust easy solutions, that whispered caution, that reminded her how quickly gratitude could tangle itself with feelings she had spent years training herself not to have. "I need to think about it," she said finally, and Adrian nodded, accepting this without argument. "Of course," he said, "take whatever time you need. My solicitor's office is on Faro Street should you decide to accept. Ask for Mr. Whitfield and he will arrange everything." They parted ways outside the shop, the afternoon light beginning to fade into evening, the street around them filling with the sounds of a city preparing for nightfall. Alina walked back toward the inn where she had taken a room for the night, the pouch of coins heavy and reassuring in her coat pocket, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She wrote to Clara that night, telling her sister that the money for their mother's treatment had been secured, though she left out most of the details surrounding how. Some explanations were too complicated to fit into a letter, too tangled up with feelings that Alina herself did not fully understand yet. She thought of Adrian's offer through most of the night, turning it over from every angle she could imagine. The practical part of her mind recognized it as an extraordinary opportunity, steady work with fair pay, a chance to build something stable after years of uncertainty. But the more cautious part of her, the part shaped by 3 years of learning to expect disappointment, worried about what it would mean to work closely with a man she had once loved, a man who was now married to someone else, a man whose kindness today had felt uncomfortably like the resurrection of feelings she had believed thoroughly buried. She thought, too, about the way he had spoken of his wife, the careful absence of warmth in his voice, and immediately scolded herself for noticing it, for caring about it at all. Whatever existed or did not exist in Adrian's marriage was not her concern. She had learned, through painful experience, exactly what happened to women who allowed themselves to hope for things that were not theirs to hope for. And yet, by morning, practicality had won out over caution, as it so often did for a woman who had learned that survival required setting aside sentiment in favor of sensible decisions. She needed steady income. Clara needed help caring for their mother. The foundation Adrian had described sounded like meaningful work, work that might allow her to help other women facing the kind of hardship she understood far too intimately. She walked to Faro Street that afternoon, found the solicitor's office exactly where Adrian had directed her, and spoke with Mr. Whitfield, a courteous older man who seemed entirely unsurprised by her arrival, as though Adrian had already informed him to expect her. The arrangements were made quickly and professionally. She would begin overseeing the foundation within the month, once she had settled her mother's care and made arrangements for her own relocation to the city. Walking back to the inn afterward, Alina felt something she had not experienced in a very long time, a cautious, fragile sense of possibility, as though a door she had believed permanently closed had opened just enough to let in a sliver of light. She did not allow herself to think too far beyond that. There was work to be done, a mother to care for, a new life to build in a city that still felt unfamiliar and overwhelming in its size and noise. Whatever complicated feelings still existed between herself and Adrian Whitmore would have to wait, tucked away in the same careful, guarded place where she had kept them for the past 3 years. But as she packed her belongings the next morning, preparing for the journey back to Clara and their mother, she found herself thinking, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that perhaps the future held more than mere survival. Perhaps cautiously, carefully, it held something like hope. The Foundation's offices sat in a converted townhouse on a quiet street, far enough from the noise of the main city roads that Alina could hear birdsong through the open window on the morning she arrived early. She had been working there for nearly 2 months now, and the rhythm of the work had settled into her bones in a way she had not expected, steady and purposeful, entirely unlike the anxious uncertainty that had marked her years of marriage. She oversaw applications from widows and struggling families, reviewed requests for assistance, and distributed funds to those the Foundation deemed most in need. It was work that required both compassion and careful judgment, and Alina found she possessed more of both than she had realized, perhaps because she understood, in ways many charity administrators did not, exactly what it felt like to sit across a desk from someone whose pride and desperation were fighting for control of their voice. Clara and their mother had relocated to a small cottage on the edge of the city, close enough that Alina could visit on Sundays, far enough that her professional life remained separate from her family obligations. Their mother's treatment had begun showing promising results, the doctor cautiously optimistic in a way he had not been able to be before, and Alina allowed herself, in small private moments, to feel something like relief. Adrian visited the Foundation perhaps twice a month, reviewing the accounts and discussing broader strategy with Alina in his capacity as the Foundation's primary patron. These meetings were always conducted with careful professionalism, held in the small office with the door open, witnessed by clerks and assistants moving through the hallway beyond. Alina had insisted on this arrangement herself, understanding instinctively that whatever remained unspoken between them needed the kind of boundaries that public visibility provided. It was not that anything improper occurred during these meetings. Adrian was, in every observable way, entirely correct in his conduct, discussing budgets and case files with the same brisk efficiency he brought to any business matter. But Alina noticed things she wished she did not notice. The way his attention sharpened when she spoke, the careful patience with which he listened to her ideas, the small compliments he offered about her management of the Foundation that seemed to carry more warmth than the words themselves strictly required. She told herself these observations meant nothing. She told herself this frequently enough that she almost believed it. One afternoon in late spring, Adrian arrived at the Foundation looking different than usual, his expression carrying a weight Alina had not seen since the day at the jeweler's shop. He asked to speak with her privately, and though she hesitated briefly at the request, given her own careful rules about their meetings, something in his manner convinced her this conversation required more discretion than an open office door could provide. They walked instead to a small garden behind the townhouse, a modest space with a stone bench and a few flowering shrubs that the Foundation's groundskeeper maintained with more enthusiasm than skill. Adrian did not sit immediately. He stood near the bench, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at nothing in particular while Alina waited, sensing that whatever he needed to say required its own careful preparation. "Margaret and I are separating," he said finally, the words arriving without preamble, as though he had decided the only way to say them was quickly, before his own hesitation could stop him. Alina felt something complicated move through her chest, surprise tangled with a guilty flicker of something she immediately tried to suppress. "I am sorry to hear that," she said, and meant it, at least the part that recognized the pain any ending marriage carried, regardless of the circumstances. "Do not be," Adrian said, and there was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of tired honesty. "It was never truly a marriage in any sense beyond the practical. We married because it was expected, because our families arranged it, because I convinced myself it was the sensible choice after." He stopped himself, and Alina understood, without needing him to finish the sentence, exactly what he had been about to say. After her wedding, after he had watched her marry someone else and told himself that duty was an adequate replacement for whatever he had felt standing at the back of that chapel. "Margaret has found happiness elsewhere," Adrian continued, choosing his words carefully now. "A gentleman she has known since childhood, someone who makes her laugh in a way I never managed to. We agreed, quite amicably, that ending things was kinder to both of us than continuing to perform a marriage that satisfied neither." Alina did not know what to say to this. The professional distance she had so carefully constructed between them over the past 2 months suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the intimacy of this confession, by the way Adrian was looking at her now, as though her reaction to this news carried more weight than he was strictly willing to admit. "I tell you this," Adrian said, "not because I expect anything from you in response, but because I did not want you to hear it from gossip, or from some careless mention at a social event neither of us would enjoy attending. You have become someone whose good opinion matters a great deal to me, Alina, and I did not want that opinion shaped by rumor rather than truth." "Thank you for telling me directly," Alina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I hope this decision brings you peace, whatever difficulties surround it." They stood in silence for a moment, the garden around them quiet except for the distant sound of the city beyond its walls. Alina felt the careful boundaries she had constructed shifting, threatening to collapse entirely, and she found herself both terrified and strangely relieved by the prospect. "I should return to my work," she said eventually, though she made no immediate move toward the door. "Alina," Adrian's voice stopped her, quiet but insistent. "There is something else I wish to say, though I am uncertain whether this is the right moment for it." She turned back to face him fully, some instinct telling her that whatever came next would change something significant between them, regardless of how she responded to it. "I have carried certain feelings for a very long time," Adrian said, his usual composure fraying slightly at the edges. "Feelings I was too much a coward to speak aloud when speaking them might have changed everything. I watched you marry a man who did not deserve you, and I said nothing, because I told myself duty and title mattered more than honesty. I have regretted that silence every day since." Alina's heart was pounding now, a rhythm that felt entirely too loud in the quiet garden. "Adrian, we should not." "I am not asking anything of you," he continued, gentler now, sensing her hesitation. "I understand that you have only just begun to build a life that belongs entirely to yourself, free from any man's expectations, and I would never wish to complicate that. I only wanted you to know the truth, finally, after all these years of pretending it did not exist." She stood very still, absorbing his words, feeling old walls she had built for self-protection begin to crack under the weight of a confession she had waited 3 years to hear, though she had never allowed herself to admit she was waiting for it. "I need time," she said finally, echoing the same words she had spoken to him outside the jeweler's shop months before, though this time the request carried a different weight entirely. "You may have as much time as you require," Adrian said. "I have already waited 3 years longer than I should have. A little more patience will not harm me." They returned to the office separately, Adrian a few minutes after Alina, maintaining the appearance of propriety even as everything between them had shifted in ways neither could fully articulate yet. Alina buried herself in paperwork for the remainder of the afternoon, grateful for the mindless busyness of case files and budget calculations. anything to keep her thoughts from circling endlessly around the conversation in the garden. That evening, walking home through streets growing dim with early evening light, she found herself thinking not of Edward, not of the fear and disappointment that had characterized her marriage, but of a muddy field years before, of laughter that had felt effortless in a way nothing since had quite managed to feel. She thought, too, of caution, of the lessons her marriage had taught her about trusting easy promises, about the danger of allowing hope to outpace judgment. Adrian was not Edward. She knew this with a certainty that came from months of watching him conduct himself with consistent integrity, from the way he had handled the jeweler's shop, from the careful respect he showed every widow and struggling family who walked through the foundation's doors seeking help. But trust, once broken as thoroughly as hers had been, did not rebuild itself quickly, regardless of how genuine the person offering it might be. She decided, walking through the gathering dusk, that she would take exactly the time she needed, and not a moment less, before answering the question Adrian had not quite asked but had clearly been building toward. Whatever future existed between them, if any future existed at all, would be built slowly, deliberately, on a foundation stronger than the muddy field and stolen glances of their youth. It would be built on trust, earned rather than assumed, and on an honesty neither of them had allowed themselves during the years they had spent apart. For the first time since her husband's death, Alina found herself looking forward to whatever came next, rather than simply enduring it. Summer arrived slowly that year, warming the city by careful degrees rather than any sudden shift, and Alina found the changing season mirrored something happening within herself. A gradual thawing of caution she had carried for so long it had begun to feel like a permanent part of her character, rather than a wound still healing. She and Adrian had settled into a new rhythm following the conversation in the garden, neither rushing forward nor retreating entirely from what had been spoken between them. He continued his visits to the foundation, though their conversations now carried an honesty that had been absent before, small admissions and observations exchanged alongside the usual business discussions, building something between them that felt less like a return to old feelings and more like the careful construction of something new. Alina's mother continued improving under her treatment, strong enough now to take short walks in the cottage garden with Clara's assistance, and the relief of this improvement gave Alina a lightness she had not felt in years, a sense that perhaps the worst chapters of her life had genuinely concluded rather than merely paused before some fresh disaster. She had not given Adrian an answer to his unspoken question, and to his credit, he had not pressed her for one, allowing the months to pass with a patience that itself spoke to the sincerity of his feelings. But Alina noticed, in the quiet moments of her own reflection, that her hesitation was less about doubting him and more about doubting herself, about whether she still remembered how to trust another person with the vulnerable, unguarded parts of her heart after years of learning to protect them so thoroughly. The foundation held its annual summer gathering in late June, a modest event meant to celebrate the year's charitable work and thank the donors and volunteers who supported it. Alina had organized most of the details herself, arranging for a small string quartet, simple refreshments, and enough seating in the garden for the 50 or so guests expected to attend. She had chosen her dress carefully that morning, a soft blue that Clara had helped her select on one of their rare shopping excursions, simple but well-made, nothing like the borrowed, ill-fitting gown she had worn to her first wedding. Looking at herself in the mirror before leaving for the gathering, Alina felt something she had not expected. A small, quiet confidence in the woman looking back at her, someone who had survived considerable hardship and emerged from it not diminished but strengthened. The gathering proceeded pleasantly enough, guests mingling among the flowering shrubs, the string quartet providing gentle music that drifted across the garden without demanding too much attention. Alina moved among the guests, thanking donors, introducing volunteers, performing the careful social choreography that her position required, all while aware, in the periphery of her attention, of exactly where Adrian stood throughout the afternoon. He found her eventually, near sunset, when most of the guests had begun their farewells, and the garden had emptied into a quieter, more intimate space than it had held during the height of the celebration. She was standing near the same stone bench where he had confessed his feelings months before, watching the last light fade behind the townhouse. The gathering was a considerable success, Adrian said, coming to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without quite touching. "Thank you for saying so," Alina replied, "though I suspect you are simply being kind." "I am rarely simply kind," Adrian said, a small smile touching his mouth. "Ask any of my former business associates. I say what I mean, Alina, or I say nothing at all." She turned to look at him fully then, understanding that this observation was not merely about the gathering, that it carried the weight of everything he had told her in this same garden months before, that everything he had said then had been offered without exaggeration or manipulation, simply the honest truth of a man who had waited years to speak it. "I have thought about what you told me," Alina said carefully, "about your feelings and the years you spent not speaking them." And Adrian's voice was quiet, careful, betraying none of what she suspected must be considerable nervousness beneath his composed exterior. "I am no longer the same woman who stood in that chapel 3 years ago," Alina said. "I am not certain I am even the same woman who walked into that jeweler's shop several months ago, desperate and frightened and uncertain how I would manage. I have learned things about myself since then, about what I am capable of, about what I deserve, that I did not fully understand before." "I would never wish to diminish anything you have built," Adrian said. "Whatever you decide, Alina, know that my respect for you exists entirely separate from whatever feelings I hold beyond it." "I know that," she said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. "That is, in part, why I have decided to trust it." Adrian went very still beside her, as though afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever moment was building between them. "What are you saying, Alina?" "I am saying," she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected, "that I am tired of losing years to fear and duty and the expectations of other people. I lost enough years already, watching you walk out of a chapel I could not follow you from, wondering what might have happened if either of us had been braver. I do not wish to waste any more time being cautious about something I have known, in some quiet corner of myself, since I was 17 years old in a muddy field." She reached into her pocket then, and withdrew the sapphire brooch, the one Adrian had refused to let the jeweler undervalue, the one she had kept safely through every trial of the intervening months, and held it out to him. "I want you to have this," she said. "Not to sell, not as payment for anything, but as something to keep, the way I have kept it, through every difficulty that came before this moment." Adrian took the brooch carefully, examining it in the fading light, the small sapphires catching what remained of the sunset in tiny, brilliant flashes. "This belonged to your grandmother," he said. "I could not possibly accept something so precious to your family." "Then keep it safe for me," Alina said. "The way you kept my secret today, and the way I trust you will keep whatever future we might build together, if you are still willing to build it." Adrian's answer was not spoken in words at first. He reached for her hand, pressing the brooch gently back into her palm before closing his fingers around hers, holding both the jewelry and her hand together in a gesture that felt more binding than any formal proposal could have managed. "I have loved you since a field full of mud and laughter," he said finally, "and I will love you through however many more fields and difficulties life presents us, if you will allow me the chance to prove that this time, my silence will never again stand between us." "Then do not remain silent," Alina said, smiling now, a real smile, unguarded in a way she had not allowed herself to be in longer than she could remember. "Tell me plainly, Adrian Whitmore, exactly what you are asking." "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not out of duty, not out of the expectations of family or title, but because I cannot imagine building any future that does not include you standing exactly where you are standing now, beside me, unafraid. Alina felt tears gathering, though they were nothing like the tears she had cried during her first marriage, nothing born of fear or disappointment or the slow erosion of hope. These tears felt like relief, like the final release of something she had carried far too long. "Yes," she said simply, "I will marry you, Adrian. Not the girl from the muddy field, not the widow who walked into that jeweler's shop desperate and afraid, but the woman I have become because of everything those years taught me. That woman says yes." He pinned the brooch to her dress himself, his hands careful and deliberate, and when he finished, he did not step back immediately but remained close, his forehead resting gently against hers, both of them simply breathing in a moment neither had believed possible 3 years before. Their wedding took place the following autumn, in a small chapel far removed from the grand cathedral where his family typically held such ceremonies. A modest, intimate gathering that included Clara, their recovering mother, and the handful of foundation staff who had become genuine friends during Alina's months of work there. No candle went out during the ceremony, and if it had, everyone present would have noticed, because every eye in that small chapel remained fixed on the two people standing at the altar, finally, after everything, exactly where they belonged. Alina wore the sapphire brooch pinned above her heart throughout the ceremony, a small, brilliant reminder of everything she had survived to arrive at this particular moment, this particular joy, earned rather than given, built slowly and carefully from the wreckage of everything that had come before. Years later, when their own children asked about the brooch that their mother still wore on special occasions, Alina would tell them a careful, simplified version of the story, about a difficult time in her life, about a duke who found her selling her last treasured possession, about a love that had waited patiently through years of silence and separation to finally, properly begin. She would not tell them everything, the fear and desperation and the particular quality of grief that had marked her first marriage. Some stories, she had learned, were meant to be carried privately, honored through survival rather than detailed recitation. But she would tell them always that hope sometimes arrives quietly in unexpected places. In the middle of a transaction meant to secure nothing more than a mother's medical treatment, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply say yes, when everything in their careful, cautious heart has finally, truly, learned to trust again.